Welcome, early birds. We'll be kicking off the webinar at the top of the hour on GP inventory. Thank you for joining us. Well, according to my iPhone, it is the top of the hour, and I'd like to welcome you to our third installment of GP Office Hours. It's my pleasure to introduce your speaker for today, Sandy Wickman. Sandy is a senior business consultant for us at LBMC Technology Solutions. And Sandy has seen it all. She was one of the first implementation experts to earn Dynamics Credentialed Professional Certification. And currently today, Sandy is a sought after speaker. You may have seen her last year at Community Summit. She led sessions on both Great Plains topics and Business Central topics, and served on multiple panels as an expert. She brought her expertise and talked about sales, marketing, and a number of other topics on the Ask the Experts panel. She did such a great job that they are bringing her to Dynamics Con live coming up in Denver this May 13th through the 16th, where she'll be serving as an expert on another panel. Little bit of housekeeping before I turn the reins over to Sandy. Within 48 hours of the webinar, I'm going to be emailing you a link to the recording of this session, along with a copy of the slides and a link to the survey. But for those of you who are in attendance today, we have a very special offer. If you fill out and complete our survey before midnight tonight, you will be placed into a drawing for a $250 Amazon gift card. So if you check the chat, you'll see a link there. You won't have to wait for the follow-up email. You should have it right there. Let me know if you don't see it. I will go ahead and send it again. But again, the clock is ticking following the webinar. If you would just take, when I was creating the survey, Microsoft conveniently told me that it takes 4 minutes to complete. So if you take 4 minutes of your day and submit it to us before midnight, you will be in the drawing for the $250 Amazon gift card. We have chat and Q&A function available today. If you have any questions for Sandy, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer as many of those as we can as we get to the end of the presentation. So without wasting any more time on housekeeping or what I have to say, Sandy, please take over.
Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you today on the topic of inventory. And hopefully, by the time that we complete this, you'll be able to feel empowered to be able to say, you got this. With regard to our session agenda, we're going to break it up into three pieces. So, the inventory module best practices, and we're going to focus on some things like valuation methods, costing impacts, and so forth. We'll look at transactional controls. How can you keep your inventory more accurate? We'll look at reconciling and investigating. How do we find it when things go wrong? And then at the end, depending on the amount of time we have left, we're going to look at inquiries and utilities best practices and some features that are related to inventory in the recent GP releases. So the starting place, right? Steps 1 through 4, valuation methods, costing impacts, all of those setup kinds of things that you do at the beginning of using inventory or at the point at which you re-implement inventory if that's a requirement for you. These things all lay the groundwork for you being able to have accurate, reasonable inventory and be able to follow them through the processes that you take with your inventory items. So we're going to jump into GP. We'll look at decimal places, units of measure, landed cost, and valuation methods. So I'm here in my Dynamics GP environment. I'm going to go to the inventory area page, and we're going to start off with just an item card. You'll notice that on my item maintenance window, I have red bold text. Those are calling out to me the required fields for that particular window. I highly recommend that you include that for each user's setup so that each user would have access to seeing what the required fields are on any of the windows that they're in. And for this particular one, it's item maintenance description and that unit of measure schedule. So we're going to start out with an item that I've called silicone. Now, certainly one of the best practice considerations when you're using inventory is whether your item numbers are, I'll call smart numbers, or whether you use more of a random assignment of item numbers. GP allows for either one. There are arguments for both. And it really depends largely on whether you're a manufacturer, distributor, or whether you're using inventory for a simpler purpose than those two. One of the things that's important here in this window is this class ID. The class ID is an opportunity for you to roll out to any new items the defaults that you have set up in the class ID. And one of the great things about that is that some of those defaults, like this maintain history area, will be completed automatically at the point of selecting a class ID on a new item, which is a benefit to you. You certainly want to maintain the history about all of those details about your items and their transactions. Additionally, the Accounts button gives us an ability to set those default accounts once here at the item class and not have to select all of those every time I create a new item. So I highly advocate for the use of a class ID. The decimal places immediately beneath that, you'll see here I have quantity decimals for this particular item of 5 quantity decimals. That means that I have the ability to be able to stock and transact in decimal places all the way to 5 places. Now we're going to look a little more at that in the unit of measure schedule in a moment. But in this case, I also want to point out that the currency decimals is actually grayed out in my environment. Currency decimals becomes available to you by activating the multi-currency functionality. You don't have to transact in multiple currencies in order to set that up, but what it will allow you to do is to have more decimal places than 2 for the currency decimals for an item. So where that might be important to you is if you're buying things that each unit has a very small value to them, nuts and bolts comes to mind. Some things like that, where it might be 0.002 of a penny, that dollar amount would need to go out farther than the 2 decimal places that's out of the box without the multi-currency enablement. Okay, so that's our decimal places. The unit of measure schedule then plays a part in that. When I drill back to my unit of measure schedule, this decimal places here must match the decimal places here. So if I tried to pick a different unit of measure schedule that didn't have a coordinating decimal places in the quantity, it would disallow that because it doesn't match. So for my unit of measure schedule for my silicone, you'll see here I have a whole bunch of different kinds of units. So I think it's an underutilized thing, the unit of measure schedules. Um, for example, on this one, I have ounce as my base unit of measure. So 1 ounce. How many ounces equal a gallon? So I can convert the ounces to a gallon. I can convert the ounces to a quart, and then I can convert the quarts to a gallon, right? So pretty simple for those of us who've used liquid measure before. But in my case, I might buy this as a tube, but I have 2 different tube sizes. I have a 16-ounce tube and a 32-ounce tube. So as long as my unit of measure indicates the quantity along with the tube, as I have in this case, I can have 2 different units of measure. Each of them will actually transact a different number of ounces, right? And then in this case, my 16-ounce tubes come in a case. It converts it down to ounces, and it converts it to the number of tubes that show up in my 16-ounce case, 16 case of 12, case of 12. So there's a good deal of functionality here in that unit of measure schedule. I want to go a little farther with that and show you on my Go To button, if I go to the purchasing.
Oh, Sandy, we're having a headset malfunction, it sounds like.
Hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry about that. So this default purchasing unit of measure is now set to gallons. So when I create a purchase order, that gallon is going to show up, and I'm going to show you what that looks like when we create a purchase order. Additionally, within this, you'll notice that there's some purchasing options. So for an ounce, I have the ability to transact in whole and fractional. For those tubes, you would never have a part of a tube. So we're not going to allow that to be purchased in fractional units, only in whole units. Quarts, gallons, we have the potential for fractions. Now, as we think about our inventory, the valuation method for this particular item is FIFO perpetual, first in, first out, actual cost. So when you're thinking about actual cost, this becomes important at the bottom here where I'm indicating revalue inventory for a cost variance. That revaluation can happen based on a tolerance if you choose, or for any amount. That means if the vendor sends me an invoice and there was a slight price increase from the time that I placed my purchase order, I can actually allow the system to cost my inventory differently than the moment at which I received it, because that receiving time was based on the purchase order amount. So you can revalue your costs on that layer for the inventory at the time when the invoice match takes place. Okay, so that covers units of measure, valuation methods, and we'll talk about landed costs as we get into our actual purchase order. So I'm going to use this item I'm going to go into my purchasing area page in my purchase order entry window and create a purchase order for this item. So I'm going to buy this from my Fabricam vendor. And I'm buying the silicone item. Notice that the unit of measure that came up by default was gallon. Remember where that came from? We had that set up in our purchasing. I still have the opportunity to be able to pick any unit of measure that I choose to. So I'm going to leave that line as gallons for a moment. And notice that the quantity ordered gives me all 5 decimal places. So I'm going to get 1,000 gallons at 34.56 per gallon. And I want to select that to go to my site ID called warehouse. Now I have by default set my purchasing item detail entry window to open up automatically. And you may recall, red bold fields means that's a required field. So I also have indicated that my landed cost is a required field for me. So landed cost is an additional method of being able to add cost to inventory based on other reasons that there might be for costing your inventory. Examples of that include freight, duties, handling charges, those kinds of things, tariffs. So for this item, I'm going to use my freight and insurance that's US based. And if I look at that group, I see that there's going to be a flat amount of freight for $200, and I've got a flat amount of insurance for $100. That's going to spread equally across my 1,000 gallons at the point at which I receive my inventory. So secondly, I want to show you that same item number. Not only do I want to buy some gallons, but I also want to buy some individual tubes. So I'm going to put my 16 tubes, and I want to show you by example that if I put 10.5, remember we said we can't have fractional tubes. If I try to put any number less than a whole unit, it indicates to me that I can't purchase fractional quantities in this unit of measure. So I'm helping to make sure that my purchasing department makes good decisions because of the way that I set up this item in the unit of measure schedule. Now my tubes, I'm not going to have any landed cost on my tubes, but because I have landed cost as a required field, I've also set up a landed cost that just is none. And at this point, I would print and release my purchase order to my vendor for his purchase. Okay, so that kind of takes us through some of that best practice setups. Check my notes here. Oh, one additional thing I wanted to mention to you. I'm going to use that same purchase order and show you that there is an additional opportunity for you to use what's called non-inventory items. So from this vendor, I also buy some mats. Now, these mats are not in inventory. They're not things that I want to have account for. I don't need to stock them in inventory for selling them to customers. I'm simply buying these mats and I'm going to use them at workstations within my warehouse. So I'm picking 10 of those. And what I want you to notice is that the quantity ordered doesn't even allow me to have decimal places, right? So there is a setup within the inventory module that defines whether or not I can have any decimal places on non-inventory items. So this fact is driven by my inventory setup, sorry, my purchasing setup in Purchase order processing. Here in the center of the screen, these non-inventoried items, if I need to be able to have inventory decimal places on those non-inventory things, I can select to have all the way up to 5 decimal places for those. My current setup is for 0. Thereby, I can never order any fractional units for these non-inventoried items. Okay. So I'm going to jump back to my slide deck for a moment and see where we're going next. So inventory accuracy, how do I help best make sure that my users are transacting wisely in ways that will help support keeping the inventory as accurate as possible? Well, certainly new user training plays a lot of part in that. But additionally, we have some setups right here in GP that we can use to help drive some of those details. We're going to look at sites, both virtual and physical, reason codes, in-transit transfers, and then number 8, not allowing any overrides. Okay, so let's go start with our site IDs. So I'm back in GP on my inventory area page. In the cards section, I'm going to pick site, which opens my site maintenance window. So I'm going to start with a site called Warehouse, which is my main site, and show you that I have all of the details of the address, the phone numbers, if there's tax applicability for that particular site. And then also we have options for things like whether we're going to assign bins in that site, use it for planning, and then assigning that site to different items. So this is an example of a physical location. I also want to show you an example of what could be a virtual location that I've called quarantine. Now, you may have a place in your warehouse that's set aside for quarantine items, but in my case, this really is just a virtual location. So wherever there's quarantine items in my warehouse, um, for my company, we're using big orange stickers to say that the item's on quarantine, not moving it to a different place. However, I want to make sure that my quarantined inventory is segregated out of my other inventory in my general ledger, which I can do. So down here in this account segment ID, I've indicated that the division in my 3-segment GL account is going to be changed anytime that I put anything in that quarantine site ID. It's going to be in this 999 segment. So how does that work? So I'm going to show you using an inventory transfer entry what that would cause. So I'm going to use my item.
Sandy, we're having an audio problem.
Very sorry. Can you hear me now?
I certainly can. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to move those items from my warehouse to my quarantine warehouse. Apparently I don't have that item set up for that warehouse. So let's try this. So what it said was that I have not set up the relationship for that item to this site, so I'm just going to quickly add that. But what you see here when I look at that line item and the distributions is that it will have transacted automatically the to inventory to the 999 warehouse. Let's try that again now that we've got that set up. This particular item happens to be serial tracked, so let's take a look at this one. So when I look at those distributions now, there we go. So it moved it without me having to know anything about the GL accounts. It moved it from the inventory 000 department to the inventory 999. So what drove that was the selection of this site ID for this item. Then let's also talk about using a different item, and we'll pick that 128 RAM this time. And this time I'm going to look at reason codes. So one of the things on our list to consider was reason codes. In this case, I have only one reason code set up right now, which says that it's a quality risk. And I've selected that as the reason code. When I drill back into the reason code, finish my line item first. Let's see. So because I selected that quality risk as a reason code, my distributions could potentially say something different than moving it from one inventory location to another. So reason codes have the ability to be able to move things to a specific GL account. Now, we're going to look at a couple of other reason codes where we've got more of those details set up. So if, for example, I wanted to scrap out some inventory, that would be a transaction, not a transfer, and I can have the default offset account go to an account called shrinkage and waste. I also, within reason codes, have the ability to indicate if it's a decrease, an increase, or both. So in the case of scrap, it would really only be a decrease of an inventory, and it only relates to transactions, not to transfers. So reason codes give us the opportunity to be able to further control the GL accounts that things get transacted to. I'll do a quick transaction entry to show that functionality. So I'll use my SDRAM item. Or how about silicone? Let's pick silicone. And I'm going to scrap some silicone. And I'll do a single ounce. And notice that when I tried to put in a number that it would not allow, right? When I tried to put in a +1, it won't allow a +1. It says the reason code does not allow increase variances. So again, I'm helping my hands-on GP user know which things they can select and which they can't. And then I would transact it out of the particular warehouse. Now, again, this leads me yet to one of the other setups that we wanted to talk about in step number um, 8, not allowing overrides. So I've tried to take one quantity out in a place where I don't have any quantities to take them out of. So it actually is telling me that the quantity entered is greater than the quantity that's available. It's not going to allow me to do that. Now that functionality is set up in your inventory setup, inventory control setup, where this allow adjustment, variance, and transfer overrides. So best practice is that none of those check marks would be marked, which would allow you to override quantities. What that means is you should never allow your inventory to go below 0. Now, there is one particular use case where that might be a reason if you're doing transfers of things and setting up the transfers before they get to the warehouse, then potential is for transfer overrides, but that would only allow them to go negative until the transfers were received. But otherwise, my recommendation is none of those overrides be marked. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and delete that one. And we have looked at our sites, both virtual and physical. We looked at reason codes and we incorporated into that the overrides. So that leaves us with our in-transit transfers. So a functionality that exists within GP is this in-transit transfer entry in the transactions pane. In transit means that potentially I have something that I want to ship to another of my locations, but it's going to be a long process to get it to that other location. So one option is to set up this via site, which means I'm going to create something that is, um, I'll call it in transit, which means I wouldn't be able to go out to my warehouse and find it anywhere to be able to count it, but it does still belong to me. It's just on a truck somewhere or on a ship somewhere. So I'm going to select that in transit and then the to site that I want it to go to. So I'll pick my north site. I can include my shipping methods. How am I going to get it there? My site. And then I can pick my item numbers that I want to be able to transact for my in-transit transfer. So let's pick my 100. I do have the option for creating reason codes as it relates to in-transit transfers. Now, when I click this, you'll notice that those reason codes look different than the other ones that we looked at before, right? We had ones that looked like scrap, and so these have been specifically created for in-transit transfers. By default, the quantity picked shows up there, and this item, you may recall, is serial tracked. So I can look and see which serial number gets selected. I can select the one that I want it to select, and I can even enforce the landed cost groups. So I can use that same group of landed costs to add additional costs to an in-transit transfer. So in this item number, my 100 XLG, the lot numbers are single digit, and the lot number that I picked is this lot number 2. It actually did that by FIFO, first in, first out. If that's not the lot number that I'm actually going to ship, then I have another opportunity to pick which, serial number it is that gets transacted instead of that being the one. Now, this functionality allows you to then ship, which is a separate step, right? So you can print a packing slip for an in-transit transfer. The shipping department can click on the ship button, which ships it out to our in-transit site, our via site. So this item would move to the in-transit site, and then you have an ability to do an actual inventory receipt into the site that it gets received in. So we'll give it a quick ship. We'll see our transfer journal. I can reprint that packing slip if I need to do that. This packing slip can certainly be in any format that you like. So if this is too simple, we can have any other sort of packing slip that you choose. We'll do this one. This one shows that it's been reprinted, but you have the document number as well as many of the other details, including the item and the quantity and the serial number of the item that's coming. So in-transit transfers with reason codes and the functionality to then be able to see that inventory in an in-transit site until such time as it gets to the place where it's going to ultimately reside. Okay, take a sip of water. So our last three steps then are inventory. Where is it? My suspicion is that many of you have not had the opportunity to see available to promise. So that number 9 here, ATP, available to promise, I'm going to show you what that looks like. I think it's a great tool. Number 10 is the historical inventory trial balance, HITB. That HITB is the only report that Microsoft recommends using for reconciling your inventory subledger to the general ledger. And I'm going to speak more to that in a moment. Allocations, and then an inventory all in one view. So let's go back to our GP. We're still on our inventory area page. And here in my inquiry pane, I'm going to pick available to promise, ATP. We'll stick with my 100 XLG item. And I can tell it in which case I want it to show. Do I want to see it based on eaches or cases? And let's pick the warehouse. For this specific site ID, available to promise gives me a one-stop place to be able to get all kinds of information about this item. So it shows that I have 29 on hand in the warehouse. 5 of those are already allocated, which means that I have 24 available to promise right now, but I have 10 on an incoming purchase order or transaction. In this case, it's an adjustment transaction, which gives me a total free forward of 34. So I have pending inventory receipts. If I had any PO receipts, they would show up here. And my current available to promise is 24. So within one place, I got a whole lot of information. I can click the 2 down arrows, which is your show button, which further gives me some details. And then down here at the bottom, I can tell it that I want to know about when I'll be able to have a required quantity of 10 available and then calculate the date. It'll tell me when I'll have 10 available. But what if I tell it I need to have 32 available and calculate the date? It changes the date because I actually have this transaction that will have transacted in time for a 421 available date. Pretty cool? I'm also going to do this one with the silicone item. So I showed you a number of different unit of measures within that display of unit of measure schedules. So my base unit of measure is what comes up, and I can go and then look at whatever site I pick and redisplay it.
We're having an audio issue again. I think it was when you first pulled up this screen, it started to warble a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me
Yep,
now?
I can. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a new headset coming tomorrow. Okay, so this silicone one available to promise has nothing available to be able to calculate. So at the point at which I send my silicone purchase order, remember we did a purchase order for that silicone, we would have indicated what my requested ship dates would be for that silicone item, right? So within the line details, I would have indicated what I want my promise dates to be for the delivery of that. So let's go ahead and release this purchase order. By printing it, I've released the purchase order. It's now changed for a PO status of released. Let's go back to our available to promise and redisplay our window. And immediately I have new information about how much I can expect to have, who the vendor is it's coming from, and if these had different dates, I would be able to see how much I could make available on any particular day. So available to promise inquiry, I think is a wonderful opportunity for people to know details about items as they're determining timing for their sale, their use, their receipt, and so forth. Okay, within the inventory area page, in the reporting section this time, I'm going to activity, and the very last one is the historical inventory trial balance. HITB. Now, I've set up a couple of different report options. One of them I just called demo. And in this case, I have left it at the detail level versus summary. And I've got all of my items, including items with zero quantity, items with zero value, with this sort of a printout or at the summary level, once that prints to the screen, and I recommend you print it to the screen, not to the printer, because it can be a lengthy process to print it. So once that prints out to our screen here, the total value of this report should balance to your general ledger. Now I also have an additional report option I called quarantine. And this time I set it to default by only including one site ID called quarantine. I don't have anything in that quarantine location at this point, but that's how I would be able to see what amounts would match my 999 quarantine inventory, because I would be able to see what inventory was in the quarantine site. So in this way, you can see how having a site ID with those default segment values in the setup of a site, how that works together for your period and reporting and validation that it reconciles to your GL. Okay, so if you happen to be using something like a historical stock status for your reconciliation from subledger inventory to GL, please know that that was never designed to reconcile to your GL. There are transactions that the historical stock status does not pick up that the HITB does. And so we recommend that you use the HITB um, for those reconciliations. If by chance you don't have the HITB report showing in that location, then there is a set of steps that's necessary to turn on the historical inventory trial balance. So we would be happy to help you with that, get the installation set up and the reset so that it knows where to start. Okay, just a couple more things. So we're going to look at allocations. So here in my inquiry pane, I'm going to look for item allocations. And in this case, I'll look for my 100 XLG item. In this window, I see a number of different sorts of allocations. I can use the show button, the two down arrows, which is the show button, to be able to see the details. So these are on sales transactions. This is on an in-transit transfer that we created. This one's on a regular transfer. And all of these can be drilled back to, plus I can see the total items allocated here at the bottom of the window. Inventory allocations window, very useful. There's an item that has not got lot controls, so you can also see additional details in this window. And you can also use this module restrictions to be able to see which parts of this you want it to show. For example, if I only really wanted to see the inventory, notice how my list changes. Only the inventory ones are showing up. If I only wanted to see purchase related, sales related, and this module restriction box, if you hold down the control key, you can make selections for either ranges. Hold it down and click the one all the way at the bottom. You can click individual ones, right? So you can select as many of them as you choose and isolate it to only a subset of them if you prefer. Okay, then the last one was the inventory all-in-one view. I'm here in my inquiry pane, inventory all-in-one view. So the all-in-one views have existed for several versions of GP. The inventory one is probably the least useful in that it really has quantity in, quantity moved, and quantity out. So not necessarily as much functionality as one might assume you would have if you were looking at something like the purchase order one, which is a very well used all-in-one view. But you do have the ability then to see the quantities coming in, what's been moved, and what's going out for your specific item that you select in the top part. You can also then restrict it to say, I only want to see what was transacted in out at my north location, and it calculates and says there were none that met that criteria. Okay? All right, so I'm going to take a pause there and ask Dawn if there are questions because I have a few more slides, but only if we have no questions that we need to answer.
Well, a question, Sandy. This goes back to when you were talking about currency decimals.
Mhm.
And the question is, if someone previously turned on currency decimals and accidentally set 3 decimals for some patterns, is there a way to change that back to 2 decimals?
Yes, the answer is yes. Um, it it certainly is not something that I would suggest that you take on your own. But yes, we do have some steps that we could take to set it back to a different currency decimal places. So I would suggest that you send in a help desk ticket to techhelp at lbmc.com, techhelp at lbmc.com, and we'd be happy to get someone who can help you do that.
Very good. Here's another question. What happens when you change the item card from 2 decimal places to 0?
So good question. There are utilities that are available to be able to change things like the decimal places for a specific item, and that's in the quantity decimals. So in the utilities of inventory is an ability to be able to change decimal places. But again, those changes um, are things that you want to make sure you go through a set of steps to validate the details first and afterwards. So typically we would say do a full backup of your database, make sure all the users are out. We would make the change in the quantity decimal places, um, and you likely will need to have no quantity of the item, which means you may have to transact it out, make the change, transact the quantities back into GP. So again, we'd be happy to help you, but yes, there are utilities to help you do that with.
All right, and the final question, one just came in. Is there a date range for the inventory all in one view?
There's not in
Okay.
the all-in-one view. There is in the item allocations window now. That's actually one of the things that we might take a look at. There is in the allocations, but there is not in the all-in-one view.
Okay. Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, then I'm going to press on with a couple more slides. Please do ask your questions if there's other things that you're interested in knowing about. So Dynamics GP October 2019 release was the last inventory specific enhancements. That doesn't mean that they aren't still considering making enhancements for inventory. So if you have other suggestions about things you'd want to enhance in the inventory modules, there is a URL that you can log into and either vote on other people's suggestions for new GP functionality or to be able to submit your own requests for additional functionality. So some of the things that were available as of that October 2019 release are to be able to filter the item stock inquiry by date. So we'll look at that one. Exclude inactive items on the item price list. That's helpful. And the last two I starred because, quite honestly, was surprised at how long it took for Microsoft to get those two things in there. So the inactive field was added to the item smart list and to show the user ID in the item master table. So I'm going to start with the smart list because I love these two. Then we'll go back to the item stock inquiry. So within the smart list, in the inventory folder, I'm going to expand on items, and I've created a favorite here that includes my unit of measure, but it also includes the fact that I can now see what items are marked inactive or not, and the user ID who created those items. So there's only been one that's been created, and that was by me. I'm logged in as the SA user. And so I can see that that user ID created the item for silicone. Pretty handy just to know who created the item. So within the inquiry window, the item stock window, as of this version 2019, has the ability to be able to have a date filter, date range for things that you want to see for this item stock inquiry. Now, what I want to point out though is the total stock down here at the bottom will continue to represent the entire total stock. So we're going to put in a date range here, and I want you to watch that total stock area at the bottom. So I'll put in so you'll notice here that I've got some 2026 entries, but I've restricted it only to the 2027 year. So let's see how that impacts. We now see the activity only for 27, but all of this total stock remained the same because the actual total stock is really a to-date number. And then exclude inactive items on price lists. So within our item card, if I look at the price lists, I have the ability to be able to include or exclude items based on the item, based on active or inactive. But I mostly wanted to focus on if this item, if this silicone item is one that you're going to sell, you have the ability to create a number of different price levels. These are all called retail, but they're all for different units of measure. So I can control the price for each one of those units of measure. And I also can control within the function of item price lists that inactive items. Another thing that I think is of value to you is there is a function called reconcile to GL. Now, I'm calling this out for two reasons. One, there is a utility that helps to manage your allocated quantities if they happen to get askew. You can use the utility called inventory reconcile. So that inventory reconcile also has a little sister called item reconciler, and it's in the professional services tools library. The nice thing about this one is it goes faster because it only looks at items that need to be reconciled, not every single item. However, there's a word of caution here. There are some ISVs that may not use this item reconciler in a complete way. So validate first that it actually completed everything that it needed to based on the third party or ISV products that you have installed, that it did the full reconcile function. Okay. Um, there is a reconcile to GL function. It's actually in the financial routines section that gives you an ability to reconcile to inventory as well here. So I'm going to go back to financial this time. In the routines section, it's called reconcile to GL. Now this has several different modules that it can use to reconcile to: payables, receivables, inventory, and bank rec. So best case scenario, this can be used very effectively for payables and receivables. If you find that you're out of balance and want to at least use this for inventory validation, the HITB report to the general ledger is still the place that you need to make sure that they reconcile. So you might find the differences here using this tool, but then go back through the process to make sure that your HITB goes back into alignment with your general ledger. And the bank reconciliation one, you still would have to do the bank reconciliation function to mark all those transactions as reconciled, but you can use this reconcile to GL bank reconciliation function to find anything that may be out of balance. Okay, I'll pause there once more. Any new questions, Dawn?
No.
Okay, I'm going to keep pushing then. One of the things that I typically recommend when we're doing a new implementation or implementing that HITB is that you create a manual log called a HITB log. This is not within GP. This is just a snip on this slide of an Excel spreadsheet where we've created a date, what the GL balance is, what the HITB report shows, and what the variance is. And then if there has to be some corrections, what a column is that shows what the corrections were. You know, it takes about 3 to 5 minutes for a user to be able to fill in this log if they do it every day. And if you do it every day, it's relatively easy to figure out what transactions happened that may have made your GL not reconcile with HITB. But if you only do this once a month, it can be really challenging to figure out 30 days of transactions across that to know what could have happened to make you out of balance from the prior month. So, you know, just a little bit of best practice there. Create yourself a log like this. Assign someone a task, 5 minutes a day, run the report, look at the GL account, make sure you have all of your batches posted so there's nothing sitting there unposted. And as long as everything balances, you move on to the next day, and it took just a very few minutes to do that. And with that, I hope that you're now empowered to be able to claim that you got this.
Very good. Thank you so much, Sandy. Um, I have a couple of poll questions that I'd like to ask the audience. They won't take very long. But the first poll question is, I'm curious as to how long it has been since you've had a business process review. And the choices are 0 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years. It's been such a long time, I can't remember, or maybe it was before your time at the company. and we've never had one. Give you a few minutes to answer that. While people are answering, just a reminder that the link to the survey is in the chat. So please fill that out before midnight tonight if you want to be eligible for our gift card drawing. So very good. Thanks everybody for answering that poll question. My second poll question is thinking ahead to October. Will you be attending Dynamics Community Summit in San Antonio in October? We've got yes, we've got no. I won't be, but a colleague will be, and don't know right now. And the reason that I'm asking this question is that when we send out the slides, I'm going to have some resources slides at the end of Sandy's presentation. And one of those resources is a promo code that you can use when you're registering for Community Summit that will give you a 10% discount off of the registration fee. So please tuck those away. I know that October seems a long way off right now, but we want to save you a little bit of money. And if you're going to be in San Antonio, we'll probably, not probably, we be having a customer dinner, and we'd love to be able to invite you to that and see you face to face in San Antonio. So we will end that poll. And just my thanks to Sandy for putting this presentation together and helping you out. Also in the chat and in the Q&A, a reminder that for some of the more complicated issues that came up in the questions, we have tech help at lbmc.com. You can put in your request there, and then one of our professionals will be getting back to you. So everyone, thank you for your time, and we hope to see you at the very next GP office hours. Thank you.